an art gallery, and I'm delighted to be here talking with artist Catherine Knight. Very welcome. We're going to be talking today about her current exhibition, Long Shadows, that is on the Flora Talk Gallery in Petersfield until the 3rd of June 2023. So welcome, and thank you for joining us in this conversation today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So the exhibition contains 17 paintings produced by Cat in 2022, and they're part of a series of paintings made after you travelled to Norway to visit Oslo and to see the Munch Museum, and then on to Ostengrand, a small port town on the Oslo fjord, where Norwegian artist Edvard Munch lived and worked for most of the summers from the 1889 onwards. And so, Kat, if I can ask you, can you start talking a little bit about what made you take this trip?
So yeah, the seed of the idea, I guess, had always been with me. I've always loved Edvard Munch even as a teenager. And I knew that to see most of his work, you actually have to travel to Oslo, because when he died, he gifted his whole collection of work to the state. So you occasionally get to see his work in other exhibitions, but really, if you want to see it in its entirety, you've got to make the pilgrimage. So I'd always had this idea in the back of my mind. But in March 2019, I just by chance on the radio heard author Karl Ove Knausgaard talking about his new book, which is called So Much Longing in So Little Space. And he was talking about how he had been asked to curate an exhibition of Munch's work and how he'd visited his summer house in Oskarstrand and that experience. And so then I went on to read his book and thought about the idea a lot more. And then eventually, when lockdowns had kind of eased, I managed to go in February 2022 to visit the new Munch Museum in Oslo, which is sort of 13 floors, this huge, modern, fantastic building. And also then the next day to visit his tiny little summer house in Oskarstrand. And yeah, the kind of contrast between those two things was quite huge.
And so here we have a work by Edvard Munch called New Snow in the Avenue, dating from 1906. And we've selected this because it was a work that sort of resonated with you from quite early on. And I just wondered if you could just talk a little about some of the qualities within the painting itself that attracted you or intrigued you, probably.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I used to have a copy of this on my wall as a teenager, amongst some others as well. I loved the sort of darkly emotive works of some of his most famous paintings, such as obviously The Scream and the kind of vampire. But I love this one as well. And I think it's the way he's not hiding any of his brush marks, and you can really see how everything is painted, and he's creating this kind of recognizable world, but it's also very much a painting. And then the kind of flicks of snow laid on top, again, very visible. So I guess I felt like there was a way in. It allowed me, as the viewer, a way in to understanding this kind of painted world.
And I can see that it is actually at the museum. So was it quite quite a moment really to see it in real life? I mean, it's always, I think, quite important to actually see these works. You get to know them through reproductions, posters in books, on screen, but there is something that you can't quite capture when you're standing in front of it itself. And did it resonate in a different way when you actually could see it up close?
Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing. And that's the kind of point of the whole trip, was to see these works in the flesh and see the kind of scale. And the main thing was kind of how thinly painted they were and how rapidly painted they seemed. So you can see the kind of birch trees are almost sort of bare canvas. And you could, they looked very rapidly painted, almost unfinished, and lots of raw canvas showing through. And it really was a kind of breathtaking experience to just actually be in front of them after looking at them and thinking about them for so long.
And it's really quite a contemporary painting. You know, it's over 100 years old, but it still has almost a freshness and an immediacy that it could have been painted just yesterday, really, to it. That's quite quite an interesting quality, that something can sort of endure for so long.
Yeah, and I think that's because of the kind of unfinished quality, which seems quite contemporary now. But at the time, some people laughed at his work or thought, "What's he doing? This is quite a wild."
So before we get into the exhibition, it was quite interesting in planning the exhibition to talk to you about some of your earlier work as well. And I just wondered if we could just take a step back over a few years, and because I feel they perhaps they're part of a longer journey of your painting career. And so if we could look at this one, which was painted in 2013 as part of a residency you undertook in Iceland.
Yeah, so I went to a little island off the north coast of Iceland in December of 2013, and again, I'd kind of imagined going there. I'd always wanted to go to this it seemed like kind of a mystical landscape, kind of magical, and I was drawn to the idea of the snow and the kind of small communities living in this vast landscape. It was a really sort of powerful experience. So there's very little daylight at that time of year in Iceland, so it kind of didn't really get light till about midday, and then was getting dark again by about 4 p.m. So it was like this kind of constant long dawn and slow dusk, in terms of colours reflected off the snow as well. So there wasn't kind of much actual bright sunlight at any point. So it was incredible in terms of colours, and it kind of led to about a year and a half's work based on that. And this one, it's interesting you chose this one, because I can see now, looking at it, I can see links to kind of Munch's work and my later pieces. So this is painted over another painting, so you can see the bottom, there's kind of an outline of some pink figures from a previous painting.
Right.
I quite like, I mean, obviously that happens sometimes just because of using up materials in the studio, but I quite like when there's a kind of ghost of a painting coming through. And it also takes away the kind of blank, scary canvas as well. So I quite like allowing things through.
Well, that's quite interesting, because on the next slide we have this work, which is called Frozen Shore. And again, I think that a similar thing happened here. Is if you look at the bottom half of the painting, there is this other image or almost world coming through, which is an interesting, gives a, when you notice it and you realize it's not like a direct reflection or shadow, it is actually something other. It gives a real some real depth and sort of intrigue into the painting.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that, and it's funny because it's kind of an accidental element of the painting, but it was painted over a painting of a window with curtains and sort of light coming through, so it's kind of orangey light coming through curtains. But now I've painted this over it, it kind of looks like more trees or light coming through trees. And it kind of echoes the trees on the right hand side. So I didn't necessarily plan to leave it, but then as the image evolved, it kind of started to work. So I don't always have a finished plan in my head of how I want the painting to look. I like them to kind of evolve as I'm painting them. So that's a kind of example of letting something happen, letting the painting do its thing a bit. I think I wasn't sure at first, but I think it has worked in the end.
And it also shows the distinctive sort of shoreline of that space. So this is in the small sort of port town that he lived in his sort of summer home, and it has this very distinctive shoreline that runs. The trees come right down to it, and it sort of curves around the edge of the water edge, and it appears in a number of his own works, doesn't it? Such as Melancholy or Summer Night, The Voice. And as I understand, he would paint outside, paint directly from the landscape that he was in. And there's often a singular figure, perhaps in a more contemplative mood, cited within some of these works. But your work doesn't contain any sort of figures, but it does contain that idea of a human presence. But also what's interesting about this series works is that your presence was depicted mainly through your shadow. And I think that has quite an intriguing many layers of interpretation there. Well, here are the two paintings really. So Melancholy and Summer Night, The Voice, with
Yeah.
this, say, with this shoreline. What was it like sort of visiting a space that you had seen and it feeling the same, or was it a very different experience?
Yeah, it was really strange because obviously I'd imagined going and I'd envisaged in my head lots of times what it might be like, and what will things look like and what will it feel like, and kind of hoping, I don't know, when you're planning a trip like this, I kind of think a lot ahead of going what it might be like. And he was inspired by just a kind of mile radius of this little house. As you walk around this little town, you can see, oh, this is the Grand Hotel, this is the road where this painting's in. So as you're walking along, you can see so many of his paintings coming to life, and like the little forest near the shore, which is depicted in The Summer Night. It was just amazing standing there. And yeah, it kind of felt smaller than you'd imagined, because in his paintings, it's the kind of mythical forest, very symbolic of everything. And in reality, it's quite a thin group of trees on the shoreline, but it was still kind of amazing. And yeah,
It's
and the kind of
that
rock.
hasn't changed. It's intriguing that it hasn't changed very much.
No, it really hadn't. And because it was sort of February and quite close to the end of lockdown, it was obviously quite quiet. There wasn't many people around. Maybe in the summer, it's a much more lively place. But I really did have this feeling of a bit, like time had stood still, because lots of the world feels like it's moving very quickly and changing fast. But going here really felt like, wow, it really had been preserved. So they'd preserved his little house, and things really did look very similar. So it was, quite a magical experience, really. And yeah, I saw that The Summer Night, The Voice painting the day before in the Munch Museum. And again, it's very raw, and you can really see the canvas showing through and the kind of scrubby paint marks. And then, yeah, the next day when I visited, it was a really sunny, cold day. So sort of ice underfoot, bright blue skies. And part of what I wanted to show when I was painting back here in the studio was that really intense blue of the sky, and there was a real sense of calm, which made me understand why he loved this place so much, and kind of he longed for it. So when he was away traveling or having exhibitions, he often just said, I wish I was back there in my kind of like happy house, feeling calm. And
yes, I think we've got there actually, isn't it? Is that the house, or is that the studio?
yeah, that's the house. So Licky Hughes, I don't know if that's the right pronunciation, but that means happiness house. So this was his place that he kind of longed to be. And this bright yellow painted sort of typically Norwegian style house, and then the bright blue sky. That was kind of one of the powerful things I wanted to capture when I was painting.
It's so striking, and I think people immediately are transported to that place. I think it's so distinctive of what we assume as well of that place. We can think, oh yes, that feels like that area. It feels like a real place that you could enter into. I was just going to ask you a little bit about if we just go back. So I think here we have the house, and then to the left is a little red building, and that was his studio.
Yeah, so that's the studio. I think they've remade that kind of exactly how it was. So it's not the original building, but the little house is the original building, and it's literally one room with a bed in it, then a tiny kitchen, and then a tiny guest room, which he said he didn't make too comfortable because he didn't want people to stay for too long. And yeah, this was the original museum. So when he died, they kind of kept it as it was, sort of tidied it up a bit and kept it how it was for people to visit. And yeah, such a contrast between the 13-story, glass and metal, huge architectural thing in Oslo, But here you could see, his little teacups and his toothbrush and just the very simple way he lived. And yeah, the garden runs straight down to the shore. So he was right in nature, and enjoyed vegetable gardening and
whole life really. Yes. So I'd just quite like to, within the exhibition, we've actually displayed 6 of your paintings, oil on board, in sort of a series, a run of works. And I think they kind of encapsulate, in many ways, sort of different aspects of the project, and sort of your developing themes and sort of motifs within your pictures. And so we start here with a work called Self. If I just quickly run through, then we kind of, so that's you sort of entering the landscape, and that's your shadow saying, I am here.
Yeah.
And obviously you're looking at the house that he lived in from the outside and thinking, this is your approach to it, how you respond to it more in a sort of formal way. And then this getting closer and closer each time as you come towards the windows of the house, but they are still reflecting the external landscape. And then you gradually move inside the building and look out at the landscape, which he obviously painted and gazed upon for many, many years. Again, here, this sense of being the internal and the external. Then you go outside again, placing yourself sort of a journey through the building back out into that landscape, and you end with a painting called Being Here. And I think that's just really kind of like this wonderful journey, sort of a visual journey, about the whole project, that you arrived and you're encountering something, and then you're really getting to the heart of it, and then coming back outside and saying, I've been here, I am here, and now you're part of that continuing story. I think this encapsulates a lot of things.
Yeah, it was that power of really being in that space and kind of standing here, and the kind of power of that, and the way it worked was because a curator showed me around the house. So she very kindly gave me a tour on that day, and she said, "Oh, you wait here. I need to go around this way to open up the house from the other side." So there was just a few minutes of me kind of being outside, waiting for her to let me in through the door. So that was when I was kind of, I kept being confronted by my own shadow, because it was this low, really bright winter sun. I don't know what my paintings would have been like if it had been a typical cloudy February day. That would have been a different project. But I kind of kept being presented with my very long, lone shadow, which kind of led to the exhibition title. But it was a real reminder of I'm here on my own, out in the world, doing something that I want to do, which felt, everything felt very fresh and amazing after lockdown, I think. So this felt like, a very sort of pertinent moment for me. And then, as I was looking through the windows, it was just one of those sparkling sunny days where everything's reflected in the sort of tangle of trees reflected in the windows. And then sort of being let in and thinking, oh, wow, this is, obviously I'm a huge fan of window views, and thinking, oh, this is the window that he looked out of. It was just a kind of amazing feeling. And
so I feel like you're literally standing in the same footsteps as and looking out at the same view that probably hasn't changed in over 100 years.
And then again, so one of the first things we saw was this, the Grand Hotel, which has featured in so many of his works, because he often repeated motifs a lot, whether it was to repaint a painting that he'd sold because he wanted his own copy, or just to kind of repaint paintings that he knew worked well. So this was just kind of blew me away. This building was just exactly the same, the windows and the shape of the lime tree to the left. And you can stand on this bridge, which is actually a kind of pier, where the girls on the bridge stood. So that was one of the first things that we saw on arriving in the town. Just a sense of timelessness.
Do you arrive by train? Is that? or do you have to go?
Arrived by train, and then Solfrid picked me up in a car and sort of drove me, because it's a bit of a complicated, different bus routes and things.
Right.
Yeah. So she has done this tour lots of times. So she kind of does it in a certain way where you start here and you see this, and then you walk along the shore and you see the melancholy rock, and then then you see the house from the shore. So there's kind of a definite way that she leads you around to show you all the spots. And then after that, that's when we went to the forest and saw the shoreline from that angle.
Yes. And so again, I've sort of so this is one of your paintings, Low Sun, and I think, you know, having seen, you know, talked about his work and that quality of sort of layering within the painting, but also you say there's sort of not hiding how a painting has been made and the process of making. I think a lot of our visitors also find that really engaging. It's something it gives you that space in which to enter it, but they're not exact recordings of the space. They are your response to the space, which this piece of again, this piece of text by Edvard Munch, I think, reflects. It's saying that, you know, he didn't paint. He sort of took from nature what he wanted to interpret other emotions or moods or feelings. And I quite like that last bit where he says, I do not paint what I see, but what I saw. So that it's one removed, or it's been through a process of reflection and contemplation and translation into something else. And I think that is what makes art, I suppose, in many ways, isn't it? It's that sort of whatever your source may be, it has to go through a process of whether it's simplification or even making something more complex, but it's not just a direct recording.
Yeah, definitely.
That next step to make it, and it enables then others to bring themselves to the work as well.
Yeah, so this is one of the two larger pieces that I made specifically for the show at Petersfield, and yeah, so obviously larger canvas, larger brushes, and bigger brush marks, and it was built up over a few months in terms of thin layers of paint, and lots of kind of letting the paint do what it wants to do in terms of dripping and running down the canvas. And I guess with my oil paintings, I'm always trying to keep the looseness and freshness of the earlier gouache kind of sketches. So I paint in gouache and in oil paint, but there's a definite dialogue between the two.
And I think that it sits so nicely in the space for those who've seen the exhibition alongside. So we have included the works on paper, gouache on paper, and also oil on board. And they all have their own very particular quality to them that is sort of intrinsic to their feeling as well. So how they're made is very much a part of how you feel about them. You know, the board are sort of smaller and more focused in intensity as well, whereas these, as you say, they're a bit more expansive, and sort of there's perhaps more of a sense of time within that space that you sometimes capture, especially with the sun being there, or the low sun. You get a sense of it moving on and not really stopping for you. You're part of something that has a continuation to it. It's a very beautiful and very striking painting.
Yeah, it was nice to show the two together, because I think often I think traditionally people think, oh, the big oil paintings are the kind of the powerful works, and that's the thing. But actually, I'm sort of realizing more and more that, you know, small piece work on paper can be just as powerful in a kind of different way. And I'm always sort of torn between the two mediums, but I think I just need to accept that I do both, and they can speak to each other. And I think Munch as well, he didn't distinguish between a quick drawing he did on the back of an envelope compared to a work on canvas. It was all the work. He didn't kind of think of something as more powerful than the other.
And as we can see, a little bit of a glimpse of your studio behind you, that you work on different paintings simultaneously, and you work between them. And does that sort of inform your approach on each other's, or do you kind of work on a set and then finish, then move across to another painting?
Yeah, I definitely have a kind of series on the go at once. So with the long shadows work, I would have sort of 7 or 8 paintings on the go at once, because I'm working in layers. So it might be the base layer on each of them, and then the following week when that's dry, the next layer. And I guess I'm trying to keep a sort of freshness, and less is more, so that happens by not working on them too much. So kind of leaving them and thinking about them for a bit. I think if I just had one painting on the go at once and that was it, I'd overdo it, so that my way of working is kind of lots of things at once in a kind of series. But
when you come into your studio, what you might work on? Have you sort of been thinking about a particular problem or aspect, or do you kind of come in and something strikes you that you have to engage with?
I think I'm realizing more and more that lots happens when you're not in the studio. Lots of it is happening when you're thinking about what you've done that day or what you might do, or when I'm often sort of looking at a little photo I've taken on my phone of something I'd done earlier. So I think a lot of it is trying to work out the next move. It's not necessarily actual hours spent laboring on the canvas. It's kind of might look like I'm not doing very much, kind of sitting thinking about or building up to work out what the next thing is to make something work. And sometimes I just leave them for a long time, and then I think, oh, okay, maybe they're done then, because I can't work out the next.
So is it quite a nice, an interesting experience to see them presented in an exhibition space where they come together as a group, but away from your studio? Sort of they enter into the world on their own, and they have to sort of stand up and be observed, which is a very different feeling for them, sort of, to being in your studio. They may well be finished, but they're still within that sort of a very different context.
Yeah, definitely. It's been something I haven't had the opportunity to do before, is show a whole body of work together, like one whole project, one whole idea. Because what's happened before is different painters have gone off to different places, or been sold, or been shown in different ways, and the only place they exist as a group is kind of on my website. But to actually get it all in a room, and also to hand it over to you to make the decisions which ones you wanted to choose and how you choose them, that was that's great to kind of have a different someone just saying, well, we're going to show these and this is how we're going to do it, and a kind of different set of eyes. That's been really nice to see them independently out in the world.
And then obviously some of these paintings will be going on to the Irving Contemporary in Oxford after the exhibition finishes in Petersfield. So again, it's sort of another iteration of the combination of works, with some new works being added to be seen in a different context. And that's quite nice that it has sort of this larger life.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's going to be a different selection, some of the same work, but it would be some different ones, and hung again in a different way. Still, it's the Long Shadows project and that body of work, but kind of a different iteration. So that'll be interesting again to see a different person's curation of the work.
There's more opportunity to see it as well after it finishes here, which is great. So I believe that goes on until about July.
Yes, I think it's June the 17th for about a month. Yeah,
which is wonderful. So thank you very much. I think I think it's always fascinating to hear the artists sort of be able to not just give the sort of the background to how a project came about, but to your thinking. And I think your work really reflects that sort of long engagement with the process of painting, as well as just as a practice, rather than just the subject matter of what you depict. And I think it's given all our visitors such an opportunity to see a contemporary painter and the work that they do so it's been a real pleasure for us to host the exhibition. As I say, it's on for a few more weeks until the 3rd of June, so there's time to visit or revisit.